The recording. The courthouse smelled of old wood and broken promises. Margaret Chen sat in the front row, her arthritic fingers wrapped around a tissue that had long since become useless. At 73, she had buried her husband, raised 4 children, and survived breast cancer twice. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. Across the aisle, her daughter-in-law Jessica sat with her lawyer, a sharp-suited woman who looked like she ate grandmothers for breakfast. Jessica's blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, her makeup flawless despite the tears she'd been shedding for the judge's benefit. She looked every inch the grieving widow fighting for her son's future. Margaret looked every inch the tired old woman trying to steal a child. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Your Honor," Jessica's lawyer was saying, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd won too many cases, "My client has been through unimaginable trauma, first losing her husband in that terrible accident and now having to fight for custody of her own son. Mrs. Chen may mean well, but Danny needs stability. He needs his mother." Margaret's lawyer, a kind but overworked public defender named Tom Morrison, shuffled his papers nervously. At 65, Tom was nearing retirement and taking on fewer cases. He'd agreed to help Margaret pro bono because something about her story had touched him. But sitting here now, watching Jessica's performance, he wondered if kindness would be enough. Judge Patricia Williams presided over the courtroom with the weariness of someone who'd seen too many families torn apart. At 58, she'd been on the family court bench for 15 years. She'd learned to spot the truth amid the lies, the genuine grief among the crocodile tears. But this case troubled her. On paper, it should be simple. A child belonged with his surviving parent. But something felt wrong. "Your Honor," Jessica's lawyer was saying, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd won too many cases, "My client has been through unimaginable trauma, first losing her husband in that terrible accident and now having to fight for custody of her own son. Mrs. Chen may mean well, but Danny needs stability. He needs his mother." Margaret's lawyer, a kind but overworked public defender named Tom Morrison, shuffled his papers nervously. At 65, Tom was nearing retirement and taking on fewer cases. He'd agreed to help Margaret pro bono because something about her story had touched him. But sitting here now, watching Jessica's performance, he wondered if kindness would be enough. The courthouse smelled of old wood and broken promises. Margaret Chen sat in the front row, her arthritic fingers wrapped around a tissue that had long since become useless. At 73, she had buried her husband, raised 4 children, and survived breast cancer twice. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. Across the aisle, her daughter-in-law Jessica sat with her lawyer, a sharp-suited woman who looked like she ate grandmothers for breakfast. Jessica's blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, her makeup flawless despite the tears she'd been shedding for the judge's benefit. She looked every inch the grieving widow fighting for her son's future. Margaret looked every inch the tired old woman trying to steal a child. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Your Honor," Jessica's lawyer was saying, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd won too many cases, "My client has been through unimaginable trauma, first losing her husband in that terrible accident and now having to fight for custody of her own son. Mrs. Chen may mean well, but Danny needs stability. He needs his mother." Margaret's lawyer, a kind but overworked public defender named Tom Morrison, shuffled his papers nervously. At 65, Tom was nearing retirement and taking on fewer cases. He'd agreed to help Margaret pro bono because something about her story had touched him. But sitting here now, watching Jessica's performance, he wondered if kindness would be enough. Judge Patricia Williams presided over the courtroom with the weariness of someone who'd seen too many families torn apart. At 58, she'd been on the family court bench for 15 years. She'd learned to spot the truth amid the lies, the genuine grief among the crocodile tears. But this case troubled her. On paper, it should be simple. A child belonged with his surviving parent. But something felt wrong. "Mrs. Chen," Judge Williams said, turning to Margaret. "You're asking this court to grant you custody of your grandson based on what you claim was your son's dying wish. But you have no proof of this alleged conversation, and the boy's mother disputes it ever happened." Margaret stood slowly, her knees protesting. She dressed in her best black dress, the same one she'd worn to David's funeral 6 months ago. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore no makeup except for a touch of lipstick that had mostly worn off from nervousness. "Your Honor, I know how this looks. I know I'm just an old woman who works part-time at the grocery store. I know Jessica has a nice house and a good job and can give Danny things I never could. But love isn't about houses or jobs or college funds. It's about being there when a child wakes up screaming from nightmares. It's about knowing that chocolate chip pancakes make everything better even when your daddy's never coming home." Jessica dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "Your Honor, with all due respect to Mrs. Chen, she's 73 years old. Danny is 9. By the time he graduates high school, she'll be in her 80s, if she's still alive. How is that fair to him? How is that stable?" "Because I'll love him every single day I have left," Margaret said quietly. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Williams looked down at the case file. Daniel David Chen, age 9, honor roll student, no behavioral problems. Both his grandmother and mother claimed he wanted to live with them. His father, David Chen, had died in a car accident 6 months prior, leaving behind a grief-stricken family and a custody battle that never should have happened. "Where is the child?" Judge Williams asked. "In the hall with the court liaison. We felt it would be less traumatic." "Bring him in." "Your Honor," Jessica's lawyer interjected, "surely you don't intend to put a 9-year-old through the trauma of testifying in open court about his preferences. The child has been through enough." Judge Williams fixed her with a steady look. "Miss Patterson, in my 15 years on this bench, I've learned that children often see things more clearly than the adults fighting over them. Bring in Daniel Chen." The doors opened and a small figure walked in, flanked by Mrs. Rodriguez, the court's child advocate. Danny was small for 9, with his father's dark hair and his grandmother's gentle eyes. He wore a pressed button-down shirt and khakis that were slightly too big for him, as if they'd grown since they were purchased. He clutched a cell phone in his small hands. Margaret's heart broke all over again seeing him. 6 months ago, he'd been a carefree kid who spent weekends at her house building Lego castles and learning to cook dumplings. Now he looked like a little adult, carrying the weight of decisions no child should have to make. "Hello, Danny," Judge Williams said gently. "Do you know why you're here?" Danny nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because Mom and Nai are fighting about where I should live." "And where do you want to live?" Danny glanced at his mother, then at his grandmother. Margaret could see the conflict in his young face, the desperate desire to not hurt anyone while fighting for what he needed most. "With Nai," he said softly. Jessica made a sound that was part sob, part protest. "He doesn't mean that, Your Honor. He's confused. He's been manipulated." "I have not been manipulated." Danny's voice cracked as he spoke louder than anyone had heard him speak in months. "I want to live with Nai because she doesn't scream at me. She doesn't blame me for Daddy dying." The courtroom erupted. Jessica's lawyer immediately objected, calling Danny's statement hearsay and emotional manipulation. Tom Morrison tried to respond, but his voice was drowned out by Jessica's sobs. "Order!" Judge Williams banged her gavel. "Mrs. Patterson, control your client. Mr. Morrison, please continue." But before Tom could speak, Danny stepped forward, his phone still clutched in his trembling hands. "Can I show you something?" he asked the judge. Jessica's lawyer immediately stood. "Your Honor, whatever this child thinks he has, it's inadmissible. He's 9 years old. He doesn't understand the rules of evidence or the consequences of—" "I understand that my mom lies," Danny said, his voice stronger now. "And I understand that Nai tells the truth. And I have proof." Judge Williams looked at the child for a long moment. In her years on the bench, she'd seen every kind of family drama imaginable. She'd watched parents coach children, manipulate testimony, and use kids as weapons in their battles. But something in this boy's eyes told her he was carrying a truth that adults had been trying to suppress. What kind of proof, Danny? With shaking fingers, Danny unlocked his phone. Last night, Mom didn't know I was recording. She thought I was asleep, but I was scared because she'd been drinking again and I wanted to call Nai if she got mean. But then she started talking to her friend Sarah on the phone, and I heard. He looked up at the judge, his young face filled with a pain no child should carry. Can I play it, please? Jessica had gone completely white. Her lawyer was whispering frantically in her ear, but Jessica seemed frozen, staring at her son as if seeing him for the first time. Judge Williams considered for a moment. Legal precedent, rules of evidence, and proper procedure all argued against allowing an unsupervised recording made by a minor. But sometimes justice required flexibility. Before I hear this recording, I want to be very clear about something, Danny. Whatever is on that phone, once I hear it, I can't unhear it. Are you sure this is what you want? Danny nodded solemnly. Daddy told me before he died that the truth always comes out, even when it's hard. He said being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing, even when you are scared. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. Those were David's words exactly. Words he'd said to Danny after a school bully had been picking on him. Judge Williams looked around the courtroom. I'm going to allow this, but first I want to give Miss Chen's attorney a chance to advise her client. Jessica's lawyer leaned over and whispered urgently in Jessica's ear. Margaret could see Jessica's face changing, panic replacing the careful composure she'd maintained throughout the hearing. Your Honor, my client would like to request a brief recess to... No, Danny said firmly. No more waiting, no more lies. He looked directly at his mother, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, his voice was steady and clear. Mom, I love you, but I can't live with someone who says Daddy never wanted me to be with Nai when you know that's not true. Danny pressed play. The audio quality was poor, muffled by blankets and distance, but clear enough to understand. Jessica's voice came through the courtroom speakers, slightly slurred from alcohol, but unmistakably hers. Sarah, I swear to God, if that old woman gets custody, I'll lose my mind. David was always going on about how his mother was some kind of saint, how she raised 4 kids by herself after his dad died. Like that makes her qualified to raise Danny now. A pause, then Sarah's voice, tinny through the phone speaker. But didn't David say he wanted... David said a lot of things when he was dying. Pain medication makes people sentimental. He was rambling about his childhood, how his mother made him feel safe, all that nostalgic bullshit. But he wasn't thinking clearly. He wasn't thinking about what's practical. What do you mean? I mean his mother is 73 years old, Sarah. She lives in a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that's going downhill. I have a 4-bedroom house in Westfield with good schools. I have a career in marketing that pays well. I can give Danny opportunities that woman never could. But if Danny wants to live with her, Danny is 9 years old. He doesn't know what he wants. He thinks he wants to live with her because she spoils him. She lets him eat ice cream for breakfast and stay up late watching cartoons. She doesn't make him do homework or chores or any of the things that actually prepare him for real life. The courtroom was dead silent, except for Jessica's voice continuing from the phone. The truth is, Sarah, I need that life insurance money. David's policy was for $500,000, but it's in a trust for Danny's education and care. If his grandmother gets custody, she controls the trust. If I have custody, I control it. And honestly, I've got credit card debt up to my eyeballs, and the mortgage is killing me. I need access to that money to keep the house. Margaret felt the world spinning around her. She'd known Jessica was struggling financially since David died, but she'd never imagined, but what about what David wanted? Sarah's voice asked. What David wanted doesn't matter anymore, because David is dead. He's not here to see how hard this is, how exhausting it is to be a single mother working full-time while everyone expects me to grieve properly and parent perfectly and somehow keep it all together. His precious mother gets to play the martyred grandmother while I'm the villain for trying to keep my life from falling apart. There was a long pause, then Jessica's voice, quieter now, but somehow more chilling. I'll tell the judge whatever I need to tell him. I'll say the old woman has been filling Danny's head with lies, that she's trying to replace David, that she's too old to care for an active boy. Danny's confused right now. Grief makes kids say things they don't mean. The judge will see through it. What if Danny contradicts you? Danny won't contradict me, because Danny knows what happens when he makes me angry. He's learned to keep quiet. The recording ended. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Williams looked at Jessica, who was now sobbing, not the controlled tears she'd been showing earlier, but raw, ugly sobs of someone whose carefully constructed facade had just crumbled. Margaret looked at her grandson, this brave little boy who'd carried this terrible burden alone. She wanted to run to him, to hold him, to promise him that everything would be okay now. But she stayed in her seat, knowing this moment belonged to him. Danny looked around the courtroom, then back at the judge. Nai never told me to record this. She doesn't even know I did it. She never told me to lie or say bad things about Mom. She just loves me, like Daddy did. Judge Williams cleared her throat. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled, but Margaret could hear the emotion underneath. Mrs. Chen, Jessica, do you wish to respond to what we just heard? Jessica's lawyer had been whispering frantically, but Jessica waved her away. She looked up at the judge, her makeup streaked with tears, her perfect composure completely gone. I didn't mean… Danny, honey, Mommy was just upset. I was talking to Sarah because I was scared and sad, and I didn't mean those things. Which things didn't you mean, Mom? That you need Daddy's insurance money? Or that you get mad at me when I make you angry? Margaret watched her daughter-in-law struggle to answer and felt something she hadn't expected. Pity. Jessica was 28 years old, widowed with a young son, drowning in debt and responsibility. Margaret remembered being a young mother herself, how overwhelming it could feel, how easy it was to say things you didn't mean when you were scared and alone. But David had loved this woman. He'd married her, built a life with her, trusted her with their son, and she'd just revealed herself to be someone willing to manipulate her own child's trauma for financial gain. Your Honor, Jessica's lawyer said desperately. My client is clearly distraught. She's been under enormous stress since her husband's death. People say things they don't mean when they're grieving. Enough, Judge Williams said quietly. She looked at Danny, who was still standing in the center of the courtroom, still clutching his phone like a shield. Danny, I want you to know that you've been incredibly brave today. What you did, making that recording, bringing it here, telling the truth even though it was scary, that took courage that most adults don't have. Danny nodded, tears now streaming down his face. I just want to go home with Nai. I want to help her make dumplings and watch old movies and not have to worry about making anyone mad. I want to remember Daddy with someone who loved him the way I do. Margaret couldn't stay in her seat anymore. She stood and walked to her grandson, not caring about courtroom protocol or proper procedure. She knelt down beside him and wrapped her arms around his small body, feeling how thin he'd gotten, how tense his shoulders were. It's okay, baby, she whispered in Mandarin, the language of comfort she'd used with her own children. Nai's here. Everything's going to be okay now. Judge Williams watched the embrace for a moment, then cleared her throat. I'm going to call a brief recess while I consider everything I've heard here today. Court will resume in 30 minutes. As the courtroom emptied, Margaret held her grandson and felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was 73 years old, with arthritis in her hands and a heart murmur the doctors were watching. She worked part-time bagging groceries because Social Security wasn't enough to cover her expenses. She lived in a small apartment in a neighborhood that had seen better days. But she also had 44 years of experience raising children. She had infinite patience for 9-year-old questions and boundless love for bedtime stories. She had the wisdom that comes from surviving real hardship and the perspective that comes from understanding what actually matters in life. Nai, Danny whispered against her shoulder. Are you going to be okay taking care of me? I heard Mom say you're too old. Margaret pulled back to look at his face, this precious boy who looked so much like her son at that age. Danny, let me tell you something your daddy used to say when he was worried about things. He'd say, "Mama, love doesn't have an expiration date. It just gets stronger with age, like good wine or friendship or your grandmother's dumpling recipe." Danny smiled for the first time in months. Daddy said that? Daddy said that. And he also said something else, right before he died when he was holding my hand in the hospital. He said, "Mama, if anything happens to me, promise me you'll take care of Danny. Jessica means well, but she's not strong enough for this. Danny needs someone who understands that love is about showing up every day, not about having the perfect house or the most money. He needs you." But Mom said that never happened. Your mom has been telling herself a lot of things that aren't true because the truth is too hard to face. Sometimes grown-ups do that when they're scared or hurt. But that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean we have to live with the consequences of their lies. When court resumed, Judge Williams looked rested and resolved. She'd spent 30 minutes in her chambers, not reviewing legal precedents or consulting case law, but thinking about her own grandmother, who'd raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 8. "I've made my decision," she announced. "But first, I want to address something that Mrs. Chen said earlier about love not having an expiration date." Margaret looked up, surprised to be referenced. "In my years on this bench, I've seen families destroyed by people who confused financial security with emotional stability, who thought providing opportunities was the same as providing love. I've watched children suffer in beautiful homes with parents who were too busy or too selfish or too damaged to give them what they actually needed." Judge Williams looked at Danny, who was sitting next to his grandmother, his small hand in hers. "I've also seen the transformative power of unconditional love. I've seen children thrive with grandparents who had nothing but time and attention to give. I've seen elderly caregivers find new purpose and energy in caring for the children they love." She turned to Jessica, who was staring at her hands. "Mrs. Chen, Jessica, what I heard on that recording troubles me deeply, not just because of what you said about manipulating these proceedings, but because of what it revealed about your relationship with your son. Danny should not be afraid of your anger. He should not feel responsible for managing your emotions. He should not have to choose between telling the truth and protecting himself from your reactions." Jessica looked up, her face puffy from crying. "Your Honor, I love my son. I know I said terrible things, but I do love him." "I believe you do, but love isn't enough if it comes with conditions and threats and emotional manipulation. Danny needs safety more than he needs financial security. He needs stability more than he needs opportunities. And right now, he needs healing more than he needs anything else." Judge Williams opened the file in front of her. "Therefore, I'm granting full custody of Daniel David Chen to his paternal grandmother, Margaret Chen, effective immediately." The courtroom erupted again, but this time it was Margaret's friends from the grocery store who were cheering, and Tom Morrison, who was grinning, and Danny, who was crying happy tears into his grandmother's shoulder. "However," Judge Williams continued, raising her voice over the noise, "this decision comes with conditions." The room quieted. "Mrs. Chen, you are 73 years old, and while I believe you have the love and wisdom necessary to raise Danny, I also recognize that age brings limitations. You will submit to annual health evaluations to ensure you remain capable of caring for an active child. The court will also arrange for backup care plans in case of emergency." Margaret nodded eagerly. "Of course, Your Honor. Jessica, you will have supervised visitation with your son every other weekend, contingent on your completion of both grief counseling and anger management classes. You will also submit to random drug and alcohol testing for the next year." Jessica's lawyer leaned over and whispered something in her ear. Jessica nodded reluctantly. "Most importantly," Judge Williams said, looking directly at Danny, "Young man, I want you to understand that none of this, your father's death, your mother's struggles, this custody battle, none of it is your fault. You are 9 years old, and your only job right now is to be 9 years old. Let the adults worry about the adult things." She banged her gavel. This court is adjourned. As the courtroom cleared, Margaret found herself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. Mrs. Kim from the grocery store was crying and babbling in Korean about how justice had been served. Tom Morrison was shaking hands and accepting congratulations. He'd just won the case of his career. Even Mrs. Rodriguez, the court liaison, stopped by to tell Margaret that she'd done the right thing in fighting for Danny. But Margaret's attention was focused on Jessica, who was standing alone by the defendant's table while her lawyer packed up files and talked about appeals and next steps. Jessica looked lost and broken, younger than her 28 years. Margaret made a decision that would surprise everyone, including herself. "Danny, go with Mrs. Kim for a minute. I need to talk to your mom." Danny looked uncertain. "Are you sure, Nai-Nai?" "I'm sure, baby. Some things need to be said." Margaret walked over to Jessica, who looked up with red, swollen eyes. "I suppose you're here to gloat," Jessica said bitterly. "No," I replied quietly. "I'm here to tell you that David loved you very much, and he would be heartbroken to see what grief has done to you." Jessica's face crumpled. "I never meant for it to go this far. I was just so scared and angry, and I didn't know how to handle any of it. When David died, it felt like everything was falling apart, and Danny was the only good thing left. But I was so bad at being his mother without David there to balance me out." Margaret sat down in the chair next to her former daughter-in-law. "Jessica, I know you love Danny, but love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice you make every day. It's choosing his needs over your wants. It's choosing his security over your convenience. It's choosing the truth over what's easy. I know that now, but I've ruined everything. Danny will never forgive me for what he heard on that recording. Danny is 9 years old. 9-year-olds forgive easier than adults do if you give them a reason to. But you have to do the work, Jessica. You have to get help for your drinking and your anger and your grief. You have to become someone safe for him to love." She looked at me with something like hope. "Do you really think he could forgive me?" I thought about my own mistakes as a young mother, the times I'd been too harsh, or too tired, or too overwhelmed to be the parent I wanted to be. I thought about David, who'd forgiven me for working too much when he was young, for not being able to afford the things his friends had, for all the ways I'd fallen short of perfect. I think children have an infinite capacity for love, even when adults don't deserve it. But you have to earn it back, one day at a time. Jessica nodded, tears streaming down her face. Will you tell him I'm sorry? Will you tell him I'm going to try to get better?" "I'll tell him," I promised. "And Jessica, that insurance money you mentioned on the recording, it's for Danny's future. College, emergencies, whatever he needs. But if you're struggling financially, I can help you apply for assistance programs. Maybe find you a different job. David wouldn't want you to suffer, even now." Jessica stared at her in amazement. "Why would you help me? After everything I said, everything I did?" I stood slowly, my knees reminding me of my age. "Because Danny needs his mother to be healthy and whole, even if she can't live with her right now. And because holding on to anger is too heavy a burden for someone my age to carry." 3 months later, Margaret was in her small kitchen teaching Danny how to fold wontons when the doorbell rang. Danny ran to answer it, and I heard his surprised voice. "Mom!" Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. Jessica stood there holding a small bouquet of flowers, looking nervous but healthier than she had in months. Her hair was shorter, more natural looking, and her eyes were clear. "Hi, Mrs. Chen," Jessica said formally. "I know it's not my weekend, but I graduated from my anger management class yesterday, and I wanted to ask if maybe Danny would like to go to the park for an hour, if that's okay with you." Margaret looked at Danny, who was hovering between excitement and uncertainty. "What do you think, baby?" Danny considered for a moment. "Can Night-Night come too, in case I need her?" Jessica's face showed a flash of hurt, but she nodded quickly. Of course. I'd like that. Margaret smiled. Let me get my sweater. As they walked to the small park 3 blocks away, Margaret watched Jessica trying to reconnect with her son. It was awkward at first. Months of supervised visits and careful conversations had created a formality between them that would take time to overcome. But when Danny skinned his knee on the playground and Jessica cleaned it with gentle hands and soft words, Margaret saw a glimpse of the mother David had fallen in love with. "Nai-nai," Danny said later that evening as Margaret tucked him into bed. "Do you think Mom is getting better?" I considered my answer carefully. "I think your mom is working very hard to become the person she wants to be. But Danny, even if she gets completely better, you'll still live here with me. That's not going to change." Danny nodded sullenly. "I know. I miss having a mom who wasn't mad all the time. I miss the mom who used to read to me and make funny voices for all the characters. Maybe someday you'll have that mom back, at least for visits. But if not, that's okay too. Love comes in all different shapes and sizes. You have me, and Uncle Peter calls every week, and Aunt Linda sends you packages, and Mrs. Kim makes you extra dumplings at the store. You're surrounded by love. It might not look like the families on TV, but it's real." Daddy used to say that families are like recipes. Everyone makes them a little different, but they can all be good if you use the right ingredients. Margaret smiled, hearing her son's wisdom in his child's words. "And what are the right ingredients?" "Love, patience, truth, and chocolate chips," Danny recited seriously, making Margaret laugh. Daddy was a smart man. 6 months after the custody hearing, Margaret received a call from Judge Williams's office. She was worried at first. Had Jessica appealed the decision? Had something changed? But the call was about something else entirely. "Mrs. Chen," the court clerk said, "Judge Williams asked me to contact you about a program we're starting for grandparents raising grandchildren. She mentioned your case specifically as an example of how love and stability can provide everything a child needs. Would you be interested in speaking to other families going through similar situations?" Margaret looked across her living room, where Danny was building an elaborate Lego city on the coffee table, his tongue poking out in concentration, just like his father used to do. In the past year, he'd grown 2 inches, gained 10 pounds, and started sleeping through the night again. His grades were excellent, he'd made friends in his new school, and he'd learned to make dumplings that were almost as good as hers. More importantly, he'd learned to laugh again, to trust again, to be a child again. "I'd be honored," Margaret told the clerk. A year later, Margaret stood in front of a room full of grandparents, sharing her story. She talked about the fear of taking on such a huge responsibility so late in life, the challenges of keeping up with a young child's energy, the financial struggles, and the sleepless nights. But mostly, she talked about the gifts. The morning conversations over breakfast, the homework sessions at the kitchen table, the bedtime stories and scraped knee kisses, and proud moments at school plays. She talked about how caring for Danny had given her a new purpose, how his presence had filled her small apartment with life and laughter. "People ask me if I regret fighting for custody. They ask if I'm sorry I took on such a big responsibility at my age. And I always tell them the same thing. Raising Danny isn't a burden I'm carrying. It's a privilege I've been given. He's not taking years off my life. He's giving meaning to the years I have left." After the meeting, a younger woman approached her, maybe 40, with tired eyes and worry lines that shouldn't have been there yet. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Sarah Martinez. My daughter Maya is 8, and I'm fighting my ex-son-in-law for custody after my daughter died in a car accident. He's claiming I'm too old, too set in my ways, that Maya needs a modern family. I don't know if I can win." Margaret looked at this woman who was carrying the same fears she'd once carried, fighting the same fight for a child who needed her love. "Let me tell you something," Margaret said gently. "Love doesn't have an expiration date. It doesn't become less valuable because you've had more practice giving it. And sometimes the thing a child needs most isn't someone young and energetic. It's someone who's learned that the most important thing you can give a child is your full attention and unconditional acceptance." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "But what if the judge doesn't see it that way?" Margaret thought about Danny, asleep in his bed at home, surrounded by the security of knowing he was loved completely and without conditions. She thought about Jessica, who had successfully completed her programs and was now rebuilding her relationship with her son slowly and carefully. She'd never be his primary caregiver again, they all understood that, but she was learning to be his mother in whatever way she could. On a warm Saturday morning in May, Margaret was in the kitchen making Danny's favorite chocolate chip pancakes when she heard voices from the living room. Danny was on the phone with someone, his voice animated and happy. "No way, really? That's so cool. Nai, come here, you have to hear this." Margaret walked into the living room, wiping her hands on her apron. Danny was holding the phone out to her, practically bouncing with excitement.
"It's Judge Williams. She wants to talk to you." Margaret took the phone, surprised. She hadn't spoken to Judge Williams since the custody hearing. "Mrs. Chen, this is Patricia Williams. I hope you don't mind me calling on a Saturday morning." "Of course not, Your Honor. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine. Actually, I'm calling with some news. You know that program you've been helping with, speaking to grandparents raising grandchildren?" "Yes." "Well, it's been so successful that the state wants to expand it. They're looking for someone to coordinate the program, someone who understands the challenges and can speak from experience. The position pays well enough to let you quit the grocery store, and it comes with full benefits, including excellent health insurance." Margaret sat down heavily on the couch, Danny watching her with curious eyes. "Are you offering me a job, Your Honor?" Judge Williams laughed. "I'm offering you a chance to help other families find the same kind of happiness you and Danny have found. Interested?" Margaret looked around her small apartment, at the photos of David on the walls, at Danny's baseball trophies lined up on the bookshelf, at the kitchen table where they did homework and ate meals and talked about everything from school friends to missing his father to what they wanted to do on the weekend. It wasn't much by some people's standards, but it was home. It was love. It was proof that sometimes the most important battles are won not with money or perfect circumstances, but with truth and courage and the determination to do what's right. "I'm very interested," she told Judge Williams. 3 years later, Margaret's program had helped over 200 families navigate custody issues, support services, and the emotional challenges of grandparents raising grandchildren. Danny was 14, taller than his grandmother, and fiercely protective of her, though he still let her cut his hair and still helped her make dumplings every Sunday. Jessica had remarried, a kind man named Robert, who understood that loving Jessica meant accepting her complicated relationship with her son. Danny liked Robert, which had surprised everyone, including Danny himself. Jessica now saw her son every other weekend and 2 weeks in the summer. And while their relationship would never be what it might have been, it was honest and healing and growing stronger each year. On the anniversary of David's death, the three of them, Margaret, Danny, and Jessica, met at the cemetery. They brought flowers and Danny's latest school picture and sat together in the grass, sharing memories of the man they'd all loved in different ways. "I think about what would have happened if you hadn't fought for me," Danny said to his grandmother as they walked back to the car. He was 14 now, with his father's thoughtful nature and his grandmother's gentle strength. "What do you think would have happened?" Margaret asked. Danny considered this seriously. "I think I would have survived, but I don't think I would have been happy. I don't think I would have learned that families can be different shapes and still be perfect. I don't think I would have learned that love is something you do, not just something you feel." Margaret felt her heart swell with pride. This boy, this young man, had grown into someone his father would be so proud of. "And I don't think Mom would have gotten gutter," Danny continued, glancing back at Jessica, who was still sitting by David's grave, talking quietly to the headstone. "She needed to lose me to find herself. That sounds weird, but it's true." Margaret nodded. Sometimes the hardest gift you could give someone was the natural consequences of their choices.
Jessica's journey to healing had begun the day she lost custody of her son, not because losing him was the goal, but because it was the only thing that could break through her denial and force her to confront what she'd become. Nai, Danny said as they reached the car. When I graduate high school, I want to study law. I want to help kids like me. Kids who need someone to listen to the truth, even when the adults in their lives are too scared or too hurt to tell it. Margaret smiled, remembering the 9-year-old boy who had stood in a courtroom with a phone in his trembling hands, brave enough to reveal a truth that would change all their lives. I think you'd be an excellent lawyer. You already know the most important thing, that justice isn't about winning or losing. It's about making sure the people who need protecting get protected. 5 years after that day in Port, Margaret was 78 years old and Danny was 19, a sophomore at the State University studying pre-law on a partial scholarship. He came home every other weekend, ostensibly to do laundry and eat home-cooked meals, but really to make sure his grandmother was taking her medications and eating properly and not trying to carry groceries up 2 flights of stairs by herself. Margaret's program had grown into a statewide initiative, and she'd been honored by the governor for her work with families in crisis. But her proudest achievement was sitting across from her at the kitchen table, arguing passionately about a case study from his constitutional law class while helping her fold wontons for the church fundraiser. The thing is, Nai, his hands moving expertly as he crimped the dumpling edges, is that the legal system is supposed to protect children, but sometimes it gets so caught up in procedure and precedent that it forgets to actually listen to what kids are trying to say. Margaret smiled, watching him work. His technique was perfect now, better than hers if she was being honest. Is that why you want to specialize in family law? Part of it, but also because I know what it feels like to be powerless in a system designed by adults who think they know what's best for you. I want to be the lawyer who remembers that kids are people too, not just property to be divided up. The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Danny wiped his hands and went to answer it, returning with Jessica and Robert. They'd brought flowers and a bottle of wine, and Jessica was carrying a manila envelope that she set carefully on the counter. "How are my favorite people?" Jessica asked, kissing Margaret's cheek and ruffling Danny's hair, which he tolerated with good humor. "Busy making dumplings and solving the world's problems," Margaret replied. "Danny's been explaining why the family court system needs reform." Robert laughed. "Still planning to be the lawyer who saves all the kids?" "Someone has to," Danny said seriously. "Besides, I have excellent training in how to present evidence." He grinned at his mother, who rolled her eyes but smiled back. The relationship between Danny and Jessica had evolved into something neither of them had expected. She would never be the primary parent. That role belonged to Margaret, and everyone accepted that. But she had become something perhaps more valuable, a friend, a supporter, someone who loved him without needing to control or possess him. "Actually," Jessica said, picking up the envelope from the counter, "Robert and I have been talking and we want to do something to honor David and everything that's happened since we lost him." She opened the envelope and pulled out legal documents. "We're establishing a foundation, the David Chen Foundation for Children's Advocacy. It will provide legal support for children in custody battles, fund training for family court judges, and support programs like the one you run, Margaret." Margaret stared at the papers, then at Jessica. "I don't understand. This would cost." "The life insurance money," Jessica said quietly. "The money I was so desperate to control 5 years ago. It's been sitting in that trust, growing, waiting for the right use. David always said money was just a tool. What mattered was what you built with it." Danny looked up from the legal documents, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mom, this is incredible. Dad would be so proud." "I hope so," Jessica said. "I hope he'd be proud of us all. Of you for having the courage to tell the truth when it mattered most. Of Margaret for fighting for you when everyone said she was too old. Of me for finally learning what love actually means." Margaret felt the familiar ache of David's absence. 5 years hadn't diminished that. But also something else. Gratitude, maybe, for the way tragedy had ultimately brought out the best in all of us, even when it had first brought out the worst. There's one more thing, Robert said, pulling out another document. We want to name Margaret as the first director of the foundation, if she wants it. Margaret looked around the kitchen, at Danny, now taller than his father had been, passionate about justice and kindness in equal measure, at Jessica, who'd transformed her pain into purpose, at Robert, who'd married into a complicated family and loved them all anyway, at the walls covered with photos and artwork and certificates recognizing the work she had done with other families. I'm 78 years old, she said finally. And, Danny challenged, you told that woman at the meeting last month that age is just a number, remember? That wisdom and experience are more valuable than youth and energy? Margaret laughed, using my own words against me. You're definitely going to be a good lawyer. 10 years after the custody hearing, Margaret celebrated her 83rd birthday surrounded by the family she'd fought so hard to keep together. Danny was 24 now, fresh out of law school and working for a family advocacy nonprofit. Jessica and Robert had 2 young children, Danny's half-siblings, who adored their big brother and their great Nai, with the fierce loyalty of kids who'd grown up hearing stories about courage and truth and standing up for what's right. The David Chen Foundation had helped over 1,000 children in custody disputes, trained hundreds of family court professionals, and funded Margaret's program in 12 states. More importantly, it had created a model for how families could heal from trauma by choosing love over resentment, truth over convenience, and service over self-pity. Margaret moved more slowly now, needed help with things that had once been effortless, and had finally accepted that maybe it was time to let Danny and Jessica help her as much as she'd once helped them. But her mind was sharp, her heart was full, and her purpose was clear. She had loved a broken child back to wholeness, and in doing so, had found her own healing. On quiet evenings, when Danny was studying for the bar exam at the kitchen table, and Jessica called to check in and tell stories about the little ones, Margaret would sometimes think about that day in court, about the 9-year-old boy who'd stood up to a room full of adults with nothing but a cell phone and the truth, about the judge who'd had the wisdom to listen, about the choice between doing what was easy and doing what was right. She would think about David and how proud he would be to see what his family had become. Not perfect, no family ever was, but real, honest, built on love that had been tested and proven strong enough to survive the worst kind of loss. And she would think about all the other children out there, waiting for someone to fight for them, to listen to them, to choose their well-being over adult convenience. Children who needed to know that truth matters, that courage can be quiet and still change everything, that families come in all shapes and sizes, but the best ones are built on love that shows up every day, no matter what. The recording on Danny's phone had lasted less than 10 minutes, but the truth it contained had changed everything, not just for one boy and his grandmother, but for countless families who would benefit from the foundation, the program, and the legal reforms that grew from that moment of courage. Sometimes justice looks like a gavel banging in a courtroom. Sometimes it looks like a child brave enough to speak truth to power. And sometimes, maybe most often, it looks like an elderly woman who refuses to give up on love, even when everyone else thinks she's too old, too poor, too powerless to make a difference. Margaret had learned that the most important battles aren't won with money or influence or perfect circumstances. They're won with love that's stronger than fear, truth that's louder than lies, and the kind of quiet courage that chooses what's right even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Years later, when law students studying family advocacy would read about Chen versus Chen in their textbooks, they would learn about legal precedents and custody standards and the rights of children to be heard in court. But they would miss the real story, that sometimes the most powerful force in any courtroom isn't law or procedure or even justice. Sometimes it's just love. Love that refuses to quit. Love that fights for what matters. Love that believes in second chances and healing and the possibility that even the most broken families can find their way back to wholeness. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that love comes wrapped in the form of a grandmother who knows that age is just a number, that families are built from love rather than blood, and that the truth, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, and even when it comes from the mouth of a child, will always, eventually, set everyone free.